I'm going to be having an unfiltered, no BS discussion to show you the true diversity that exists in beauty around the world. Take full control of your quest for your own beauty. All right, welcome back to Uncensored Beauty. I'm Dr. Sean, and on today's episode, we're going to be talking about the differences in beauty standards that exist not just here in the United States, but all around the world, and how culture actually has an impact on how these beauty standards are shaped. So let's get to it. You know, I think one thing that I notice in the United States, there's a very Americentric or America-centered view of how we see beauty. Right? I think about the modifications people undergo in places like South Korea, where they're trying to build up the bridge of their nose to make it more angular, or the way in which Europeans are modeling their bodies, or in Iran, how people are getting their noses done. And the way Americans tend to view it is that we created this trend, and that trend then infected the rest of the world. But that is pretty far from the actual truth. The reality is that all these cultures around the globe all have their own way of how they approach their quest for beauty, and it's not something that's just of the modern world. I often hear people talking about how, you know, it's all because social media, that suddenly everyone's obsessed with their beauty, or it's all because of TV stars. No, the reality is that the quest for beauty is a part of the human condition. If there is one thing that will never go out of style and has always been around since the advent of humans, is vanity. We love to change the way we look because the way we look is the way in which we put ourselves out to the rest of the world, and it's how then we are perceived, and then it dictates how the world responds to us. So that's why it makes sense that ultimately you're going to have people of different cultures doing different things to change their appearance, frankly. What's also interesting that a lot of people don't know is how extreme these modifications can get. You know, we look at plastic surgery in the United States and we think, oh my God, people are going and putting, you know, silicone implants into their breasts, or they're injecting all this fat into their butts, or we're taking fat from our bellies and putting it into our faces. How absolutely crazy is that? But I think after this episode, you might have a little bit of a different perspective on what exactly it is that, or what, not exactly what it is, but how what we are doing here in the US is maybe not as crazy as you might think it is, especially when we're looking at the historical and cultural context. So a couple examples I have that I really want to highlight when it comes to the cultural standards of beauty and what people do to achieve beauty. I want to look at Myanmar. It's a country in Southeast Asia. And in Myanmar, one thing that they have been known for is something called neck rings. You've probably seen this on like Ripley's Believe It or Not or some random news show in the past, but what it is they quite literally, the women of those cultures will literally start to build up metal rings around their neck and continue to build them up more and more with the goal of elongating and stretching the neck. Now, how does that work? You might think it seems kind of ridiculous that just by putting some pressure, it's going to make your neck longer. It's not actually making the neck longer. What it's doing is it's starting to push down the shoulders like this and push down the collarbones and give the perception of an elongated neck. And culturally, as much as you might think, why would I want somebody with a super long neck? In that culture, specifically in Myanmar, it's a status symbol. You know, honestly, it's like the more rings you can put around your neck, the more impressive it is. That's just how it is there. And for us as Americans, it seems crazy, but that's the whole point, is ultimately our culture does not value that, but it doesn't mean another one doesn't. Another example of an extremely, in my viewpoint, crazy thing that people would do in the past, in, let's say, China, in ancient times, there is a principle known as foot binding. And you've, again, probably seen this in some horror show, but what they would literally do to women for the purpose of status symbol and attractiveness, they would quite literally start training women's feet by shoving them into smaller and smaller shoes over time, starting at a young age. Why? Because for some reason, culturally, it was seen that women with the smallest feet were somehow seen as the most desirable. Now, what would this lead to? As you can imagine, a lot of pretty devastating effects on that individual's anatomy. Because if you constantly keep shoving your feet into these shoes and binding them smaller and smaller, what would happen is the bones eventually would actually crack and they would break. So if you see a picture of a bound foot, it looks so distorted because the foot is literally bent over on itself because it has been shattered into this new position, and that in and of itself is seen as some kind of beautiful look. I'm not here to judge, ultimately. I mean, the one thing I am judging is the pain that those women were put through purely for beauty standards, which, whole nother conversation. But I don't want to judge them on a cultural basis because that's just what their culture values. I mean, I'm sure 200 years from now, someone's going to look back at the 2010s and look at the figures of the women we had where the buttocks were 4 times the size of the waist diameter and think, what the hell were they doing? Fair question, frankly, but I think that ultimately comes down to the point that we have to see things from our own lens, but understand that our lens is not capturing everything beyond, right? The truth is that beauty ultimately knows no bounds. What we find beautiful here is not going to be the same thing elsewhere, and what we find beautiful now is not going to be the same thing 10 years from now, 5 years from now, or even a century from now. Another good example of a very extreme beauty standard that was placed comes from Ethiopia and the South Sudan. In these places, what they really valued was the size of the lower lip. And no, I'm not talking about like Kylie Jenner's size of the lower lip as far as plumping it up. I'm talking about literally the stretched out size of the lip. And the way in which they would stretch out their lower lips is through something called lip plating, which gradually over time, you quite literally take the lower lip and you start putting plates in order to start stretching that lower lip. And then what you get after several years of doing this, similar to like gauging your ears, where you do a gauge and you constantly stretch the hole wider and wider, and you see some people with holes that are like 4 or 5 centimeters in diameter. They did the same thing with the lip. And sometimes it would actually result in a piercing of the lower lip to help elongate it even further. And there are literal ceramic plates within that lower lip. Now, if you walked around West Hollywood or Beverly Hills with a lower lip plate, people are going to wonder what's going on. And I don't blame them because it doesn't fit in with the standard beauty culture we have here. But go to South Sudan, and especially in certain tribes, you would just be considered one of the more attractive people if you had a massive plate in your lower lip. Sound crazy? Probably. Is it crazy? A little bit. But again, let's remember the cultural context behind it. Another thing that I think we don't pay attention to as much now, but has been very much in the mainstream in its own form, especially over the last couple hundred years in Western society, is the principle of waist training. This to some extent fell out of style, I would say probably between the 1990s to around the 2010s. And the only reason waist training kind of fell out of style was because the aesthetic, especially for women, had no longer been centered around curves, but really was focused more on kind of like just the washboard body. There wasn't curves that was considered to be the beauty standard at the time. It was more so just as thin as possible, the better. But now we see, especially with the Kardashians in the picture since the late 2000s, early 2010s, curves are back. Now, how do we get those curves? Sure, you can do a BBL or Brazilian butt lift where you do liposuction and you inject fat into the buttocks, or in some cases butt implants, which I personally don't love. But the other problem is that as much as you increase the size of the buttocks, you also have to figure out how to make the waist narrower. So how do you do that? You do that by things such as waist training. And waist training is another way of just basically saying wearing a corset. If you watch any movie that was centered in the early 1900s, you'll notice that most women are wearing some form of corset, and that even was like a metal cage that people would use and tighten around their rib area in order to make their waists look smaller and smaller and smaller. Now, could they breathe? I guess enough, but frankly, it was to the point where women wouldn't be able to exert themselves because they are so restricted in their breathing. Their rib cages are so tightened that they cannot take a deep breath, so they wouldn't be able to walk long distances or do anything that required them to breathe heavily whatsoever. But at the end of the day, they had a narrow waist, so I guess goal achieved, I suppose. Another thing that I think we look at that some people may consider extreme years from now are things such as hair extensions. One thing that's interesting to me is a lot of, especially men, the men that I know don't often understand how involved and common hair extensions are. But I would bet you, if you walk around Los Angeles and interviewed every woman that you see for an hour, I would be shocked if it was less than 50% of them that said they didn't have some kind of hair extension in place. And that's because ultimately hair in and of itself in the Western world, and frankly in many cultures, hair is considered to be a sign of vibrance, right? So the more hair you have, the fuller your hair is, there is a youthfulness to it. There is a vibrance that comes along with it. So what do? We use extensions. And what are those extensions? Well, there's two different types. There's ones that you can actually just clip in, where like, for example, with my hair, I would take and I would put it right underneath a piece of hair and it would create the illusion of a fuller head. But there are also the more extreme versions of hair extensions, such as a weave. This is very popular in Black cultures, especially because of the texture that exists in standard Black and African descent hair, in order to kind of fit in more with the softer hair of the Western look. A lot of times Black women will use this to put in weaves and then mimic that more Western, almost Caucasian style of hair. But it's not just for women of African descent. It's going to be women of all cultures that do this, and it's because ultimately fuller hair is seen as sexier. Now, what we don't realize, or a lot of people don't realize about hair extensions, is that hair extensions actually often lead to baldness. Why is that? Because it's pulling on your hair constantly. If I sat there and I pulled my hair like this for 3 days, just over and over again, that traction eventually is going to damage the root to the point that it's going to just say, screw it, and it's going to dump that hair off my head, and I'm going to lose that hair. It's the same principle with extensions. The reason I highlight these things is because I want to show you how far we go as human beings to try and fit into the mold that is beauty and the aesthetic world. We will literally damage our bodies irreversibly in order to get that perfect picture, to look good in society, to look fabulous for a party. And this is something that is across all cultures, no matter where in the world or the time period, we have always done this. Now, one thing I think is really interesting too about the current state we're in as far as beauty goes, we are in a unique era. Because all these things I've discussed, as far as like the Chinese foot binding or the Myanmar neck rings and the Sudanese lip plating, all these things were done kind of in an isolated world, right? Where what was happening in those areas at the time, because it was decades or centuries ago, it wasn't being broadcast around the world, so it was pretty localized. The difference between what's happening now is that we're not only being exposed to what is in front of us. Thanks to the advent of social media and the widespread media culture, we now have exposure to what happens on the far reaches of the Asian continent, or what happens in the Northern European countries or in the Southern African countries. We see all of that on our phones, and we can find out exactly what the beauty standards are in those different areas. So what's interesting to me is that we are now kind of seeing this beauty industry that's evolving, that's not only localized to where you are, but it's almost a piecemeal approach where we're taking different ideals from different cultures and merging them together to create almost this globalistic type aesthetic that we haven't seen before. A lot of that also has to do ultimately with the rise of globalism as a whole, because we're no longer just breeding with our own cultures. You know, I did a 23andMe recently and was curious to see kind of what my background was, right? I know I'm Persian, I'm Iranian, but I was actually shocked to find out that my genealogy actually shows that I have over 98% of my genealogy residing from Iran. or in that Iranian region. So that means I don't have a lot of influence of other cultures when it comes to my ethnic beauty appearance. But I think you'd be hard pressed to find a lot of Americans that exist now in this multicultural world who don't have a little bit of, all 6 or 7 continents, probably not Antarctica, but all, kind of all aspects of the world influencing their ethnic appearance. So it's almost creating this new standard of beauty because you can't necessarily fit it to a certain ethnic mold, right? So I think we have to keep in mind how social media is also changing our beauty ideals. And sure, social media has its toxic aspects, but this part of social media I really actually appreciate because it's highlighting people's beauty in different ways. So that way, if you have a certain aesthetic, like let's say, for example, like Beyonce. She's a very well-known celebrity, arguably one of the biggest black female artists we've ever seen rise up in the world. And if you look at her aesthetic, you can kind of see a piecemeal of black culture. You can kind of see a piecemeal of Caucasian culture. There's sometimes Asian influences in there. There's African influences. And I think that's very interesting to see because ultimately someone of her star power is just basically personifying what I'm talking about, where that entire world of beauty is all converging into this singular aesthetic that is actually more inclusive than anything we've seen. And I think the other thing that's important, and my last point with this, is that when it comes to looking at other countries' beauty standards, especially from a Western lens, I think we have to move away from this idea that everything is shaped off of Western ideals. Like I mentioned earlier, the Korean rhinoplasty fad, right? A lot of Koreans in South Korea will go and build up the bridge of their nose because oftentimes Koreans ethnically don't have a strong bridge to the nose and it's very flat. So they try and build it up to strengthen the features of their face. And there's also the double eyelid surgery where in South Koreans, traditionally they will have what's called a monolid. So they will be lacking the crease of the upper lid. So a surgery is done to kind of create that crease. A lot of people think that this is because somehow Western culture has influenced this and they just want to look white or they want to look American. But I would say look back at some of the statues that come out of South Korea, out of Japan, out of China that date back 2,000 years, and the most powerful depictions of individuals, even the Buddhas and the generals, oftentimes what you'll notice is they have a built-up bridge on their nose. So how does that make sense that it's just because of Western beauty ideals that suddenly they want stronger looking noses? I think it has a lot more to do with the fact that a stronger bridge of the nose actually conveys a sense of strength because it strengthens and kind of projects out the facial features in a way that a flat bridge may not. So ultimately, I would say have a wide lens when you're looking at beauty standards. Don't be so focused on just what's in front of you, and that way you'll then be able to look at those different beauty standards, see what's beautiful, and in some ways create your own aesthetic by taking pieces from each of these cultures to make it your own. Because beauty is all about you, and frankly, beauty is not about perfection, but it's about the harmony of your imperfections. It's about how you harness your own features and your own personality and turn it into one big cohesive standard that you can live by and that you can really put out to the world and feel comfortable with. So with that said, let's go ahead and move on to our glam gasp segment. All right, in this glam gas segment, we're going to be talking about something that's very jarring to many people, and that is eyeball tattooing. Yes, you heard me right, and no, I'm not talking about changing your eye color just from the colored part of the eye, but I'm talking about literally tattooing the entire eyeball itself. You may have seen this on social media if you're like me and like watching kind of disgusting videos online, but what people are literally doing, and for different reasons, they're going and getting tattoo ink injected into the white part of their eye to create, for lack of a better term, almost this like kind of demonic look where you have this totally blacked out part of the eye, and therefore it makes your eye look really just, frankly, almost like an empty eye socket. Now, I'm not sure exactly why somebody would do this. Not here to judge again. I would not personally do this because I'm not sure you'd be watching this podcast as easily if I did have blacked out eyes, but to each their own. The really important thing to know is that this procedure, though, does not come without risks. Anything that involves the actual eyeball needs to always be presented with a disclaimer that this could have a catastrophic outcome for you. The danger of putting tattoo ink in the eyeball they're numerous, frankly, but one of the biggest risks is ultimately going to be blindness. Because what can happen is that when you're injecting, you literally go ahead with a needle, with the tattoo needle, and they go ahead and inject right under that clear layer that exists over the eyeball that produces the white of the eye. And they inject the tattoo ink, massage it around, and then the ink kind of disperses throughout and then literally stains those deeper pigment. Well, for one thing, it's not reversible for the most part, because oftentimes the way you dissolve tattoos is through lasers, and it's not going to be safe to use a laser on the eye because that in and of itself is probably going to lead to blindness. But you also have to worry about that tattoo ink actually migrating to places like the iris, which is the colored part of the eye, into the pupil, and even sometimes damaging the retina. And not to mention, if the ink is not a problem, you also have to worry about the fact that you're injecting a foreign material into the eye. Any foreign material injected anywhere into your body can cause an infection, and in this setting, it can cause a severe conjunctivitis, keratitis, all different fancy words for eye infection that can actually lead to you losing your eyeball. So, if you were thinking about getting your eyeballs tattooed, I really hope that I've convinced you not to, and if you do decide to do it anyway, I really encourage you to find somebody who is a true medical professional who's willing to do it. But the problem with that is most people who are trained medical professionals are not going to want to do that for you. So frankly, if it were me, I would say maybe avoid it. Maybe go get another tattoo somewhere on your body. If you want to black something out, black out your whole arm, go for it. I don't care. But please, for all us medical practitioners' sake, please just avoid putting tattoo ink into your eyeball. So, with that said, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Please remember to hit the subscribe button below to tune in for the next episode.